This is a distinct honor and privilege to introduce Mrs. Lyons Brown, Sally, to one and all that know and love her. Sally was born an activist. Her sense of curiosity, her belief that committed people can make a difference, locally, nationally, worldwide, is a goal for coming generations of committed human beings. Sally's vibrancy, her intellect, her sense of humor, real wit, has made her an effective member of most of our nation's most important conservation organizations.
I never knew anything else except how to conserve the land, the water, and pay attention to everything that grows on the earth because we're very dependent on it.
Major funding for Sally Brown, Force of Nature, was provided in part by a generous grant from National City Bank of Kentucky, saluting the passion, intelligence, and tenacity of Sarah Schallenberger Brown. And by a generous grant from David and Betty Jones, honoring the remarkable contributions of Sarah Schallenberger Brown in conservation and historic preservation. Additional major funding was provided by Alex G. Campbell, Jr., and with support from Mr. and Mrs. William T. Young, Jr.
The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is a unique ecological environment, visually stunning and swelling with various estimates of crude oil. The Kyoto Protocol, a landmark agreement to combat climate change, is one of the chief diplomatic topics of the 21st century. Sally Brown has completely immersed herself in both issues. She was a powerful force behind the 1980 law that expanded the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Never before have we seized the opportunity to preserve so much of America's natural and cultural heritage. Now, whenever they or their children or their grandchildren choose to visit Alaska, they'll have the opportunity to see much of its splendid beauty undiminished and its majesty untarnished.
Likewise, her financial contributions to research and science planted the seed that would become the Kyoto Protocol. Two monumental issues, two ways of affecting change. History measures legendary figures not in years of service, but in decades. And in her 10th, she continues to fight for what she holds true.
Sally is a very broad-based environmentalist. It's across the board that she cares.
If she's on your side, it's wonderful. I can imagine if you were on the other side, seeing Sally Brown come in the room would cause your knuckles to go white because you know you're going to be up against someone who doesn't, at the end of the day, say, well, I'm going to pack up and go home and forget it. She doesn't do that, and that's what makes her such a wonderful friend of the environment and of all the other projects she supports.
Within Kentucky, her home since 1935, Sally Brown has worked for historic preservation, the arts, and Louisville's riverfront revitalization. To every cause she embraces, she brings a combination of vision and pragmatism.
She's interested in talk and she's interested in reading, but when it comes down to it, she wants to see results. And that's how she measures performance.
And she doesn't just throw money at problems. She gets involved with them. She understands them. She's passionate about them. And so she brings this whole set of attributes to bear on a problem and gets results.
Sally Brown's devotion to saving the Alaskan wilderness is more than a matter of environmental philosophy. Long before Anwar, in a time when Alaska was still more famous for gold than oil, it was a remote outpost of the United States Army. And so it was in Alaska that a young Army officer named Martin Conrad Schallenberger and his wife, Ina Hamilton Dowdy, welcomed their first child, Sarah Elizabeth, into the world on April 14, 1911.
Well, my father was an Army officer, and he married a Southern girl, although her father was an Army officer too. And when he proposed to her, he didn't tell her that his first post was going to be Alaska, because he was afraid she'd change her mind. So everybody was sewing all the lace on her trousseau, little entredeux and more lace and thin, fine cambric. She never got to wear those at all in Alaska. She had to go right straight and buy some outing flannel nightgowns. But that was an Army post called Valdez, and it is now the best known city in Alaska because a famous ship went down and spread oil all over the coast. When I arrived, I was the first white child born in that part of the country. Everybody else went back to Seattle to have their children. They had a fine time. My mother loved it, and they enjoyed it very much.
Schallenberger was eventually transferred from Alaska to the Presidio, located in San Francisco, to serve as an aide to the legendary General John J. Pershing.
When he first became the aide to General Pershing, there was a war with a very belligerent Mexican named Pancho Villa, and he was raiding into our part across the border, and General Pershing was sent down there.
Relocation to Fort Bliss, Texas soon followed, where the young officer served beside another familiar name, George Patton.
General Patton wrote to my father and said, I want to see if you can't ask General Pershing if he doesn't need another aide. I will do anything. And he did come down, and they were tent mates, and that's why my mother and Mrs. Patton became such close friends.
In 1917, the United States entered World War I, and Pershing became commander of all U.S. forces in Europe. While Martin Schallenberger served overseas, his family lived in Washington and New York. After the war had ended, he sent them a telegram requesting that they join him in Europe, and 8-year-old Sally, her brother Martin, and their mother headed to a new home.
So we got on a great big destroyer that was called the Zeppelin, and we went overseas, and Mother bought me a marvelous red hat, a great big red hat. I was 8 years old by then. Somebody said, there is a launch approaching, and it looks like there's an Army officer in the front of the launch. And I got very excited, and Mother wasn't quite ready because she thought we would land and meet my father ashore. And I rushed up on deck, and I had on my blue coat with red buttons and this large red hat. I thought I looked very exciting. The minute I got out on the deck, away went the hat.
Sally's father had been named military attaché to both Greece and Yugoslavia, the newly formed kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The family was to divide its time between the two capital cities of Belgrade and Athens. Stationed first in the ancient city of Belgrade, Sally suddenly found herself immersed in not only new languages and new customs, but shocking poverty and unforgettable beauty.
When we were at the dinner table, we would love to hear stories of her childhood in Europe, and they were funny and they were interesting and so different from anything else had experienced.
In Yugoslavia, the beds had mattresses made with corn shucks, and they're very rustly and they're not comfortable. So Mother was trying to figure out, how shall I get a mattress with coil springs made? And she found somebody who knew how to make things, and she said, you make a lot of little wires curved around, and then you cover it over with material and put it in a frame, and then you put a normal mattress on the top of it. But when this mattress came back, for Mother's and Daddy's bed, she was horrified. It was like lying down on the bricks. It was as hard as could be. And she said, well, this will never do. It's meant to be comfortable. He said, Madam, come back tomorrow and I will have it fixed. Guess how he had it fixed? He hired 3 little boys to come and jump on the springs all day long.
I think a lot of the things she saw in the World Wars and traveling around with the Army and living through that era really taught her to conserve and save things and not be wasteful.
And there was a family that I got to know right off, and they lived in 2 rooms. And she was a nice little Serbian girl, and she taught me Serbian. She'd say, kako se, what is this called? What is this called? And would teach me words. And we had lots of good times with her. But I'm just to show you how simple their life was. She came one day to our house and said to my mother, Mrs. Schallenberger, could you lend us your needle? We have lost ours. They only had 1 needle, and they needed it to sew. The other things about Yugoslavia were wonderful. We went swimming in the Danube, and we went on picnics in the mountains nearby, and we just loved it.
Soon it was necessary for the Schallenberger family to embark for Athens, Greece. A car trip along the treacherous stretch of road between the 2 capitals wound through the Babuna Mountain, a fantastic adventure through the eyes of a child.
It took us 6 days to get down to Athens, and we had to go through Montenegro, and then we looked on the map, and there was a huge mountain that was called Babuna, and there were no rails on the side like we have. And I can just remember how terrified I was looking over, and there was a river way down and no rails at all. And now here we would go on this curvy road. And then there were pirates that would wait for somebody to go around the curve. They'd be going slowly, and then they would hold you up. We thought it was all very adventurous, my brother and I. I can remember, though, that we would sometimes come across a little town that had never seen an automobile. And there would be women driving in an ox cart, great big wooden wheels, pulled by 2 oxen, and they would see this brown thing coming down with the American flag on the front, and a chauffeur that could punch the thing and go ooh-ah, 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 and scare the bulls. And then she would the woman who was driving the ox cart was so frightened. She had these big voluminous skirts, and her bulls were going off, and she just took her skirt and threw it over her head.
At the onset of the 1920s, Athens existed as a city in transition. King Constantine, who had been driven from Greece during World War I, had returned to his seat of power. The royal household accepted the young diplomats with open arms.
Our teacher knew the daughters of Prince Nicholas, who was the brother of the king, and they were about our age, my brother and I, and she took us over to introduce us to them. So we had a wonderful time with Princess Marina, who later became the Duchess of Kent. And they were marvelous, and we had a wonderful time seeing them, and they came to see us. When Valentine's came, we thought, well, this is a nice time to send them a great big Valentine. So we made an enormous Valentine with little windows that you open up, and have a little Greek flag in one, a little American flag in the other, and I love you, roses are red, violets are blue, and all those things. And we had our driver, who was a Yugoslav and couldn't speak Greek, take it over to the palace, which was near where we lived. Immediately, an invitation arrived for my brother and me to come at once. We went over there, and they said, We think this is beautiful, and it has lots of flags and lots of windows, but what is it? They don't have Valentine's Day.
Eager for her children to attend an American school, Mrs. Schallenberger rejoiced when, after 5 years of service in Europe, her husband was reassigned to Fort McPherson in Atlanta, Georgia.
My mother said we must be tutored because we didn't know anything about American history. We knew about Pepin le Bref and Vercingétorix and Charlemagne, but never heard of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But then we had to entertain ourselves so much in Yugoslavia that we thought we'd better organize something for the other Army children that were on the block. It was lovely to have all these young officers with children our age. Some were older, some were younger. We didn't know it was unusual, but we had the idea of the operas that we'd seen in Yugoslavia because there were no other entertainment. And we sent out invitations to all the officers, please come and see the opera. We made the cherry tree for the one about the little Japanese girl that fell in love with the naval officer. It was outdoors, and we had chairs, and they were awfully nice, and they got us all fixed like a little theater. They wrote it up in the newspaper about the children's production of this Madame Butterfly.
The rich cultural tapestry of Europe, woven through opera, classical dance, and the arts, impressed upon Sally a curiosity that would prove quite fruitful later in life. As a young woman, Sally dreamed of becoming an artist. As with all her passions, she pursued art with intensity and dedication.
Oh, Grammy as an artist, she's extremely talented, and I think she's very humble about it.
Mother is so multi-talented and primarily does watercolors, but although